Hello everyone, today we're going to look at how to prove congruent triangles using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So if we're telling you that triangle ABC is congruent to DEF, there are a few things that you could state. Looking at here, we notice that AB is congruent to DE. BC is congruent to EF. Segment AC is congruent to DF. We know that if two triangles are congruent, all three corresponding sides are congruent. Same thing with the angle. Angle A is congruent to angle D. Angle B is congruent to its corresponding angle, which is E, and angle C is congruent to its corresponding angle, which is angle F. Let's start out by looking at something we know. Given AC is congruent to BC, we can mark those segments congruent, and AD is congruent to BD. And we are told to prove that triangle ACD is congruent to BCD. So let's take a look at what we know. We know that AC is congruent to BC because that was a given. Then it tells us that AD is congruent to BD, which is also a given. If you notice right here, this side, CD, is being shared with both triangles. And if it's being shared with both triangles, we can state it is reflexive. So CD is congruent to CD. Therefore, triangle ACD is congruent to triangle BCD by side, side, side. It's congruent to side, side, side. Sometimes the problem tells us to prove a segment is congruent to a different segment or an angle is congruent to a different angle. We have been looking at triangles congruent to a different triangle. So, what if the problem states, prove that angle CDA is congruent to CDB? If you think back to the warm-up or the previous slide, we looked at, once we know that two triangles are congruent, we can always state that the three segments of corresponding triangles are congruent and each angle matches or is congruent to the corresponding angle in the other triangle. So, for this problem, if it states prove that CDA is congruent to CDB, we'd have to do all 4 steps first to prove that the triangles are actually congruent. Since we know the triangle ACD is congruent to triangle BCD, we can state that that angle CDA is congruent to angle CDB by stating this next statement. Angle CDA is congruent to angle CDB because corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. After you prove your triangles, then you could make your statement that this angle is congruent to that angle because the corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. Once we know that triangles are congruent, everything about them is congruent. All remaining sides or segments and all remaining angles. If a proof asks us to prove pieces, which is a side or an angle, are congruent, we must first prove that triangles are congruent and then use the following. Corresponding parts, so corresponding either sides or angles of congruent triangles, are congruent. Let's take a look at one more. Given QR, so segment QR is congruent to RS, and PR, this line right here, bisects angle QRS. Okay, we need to prove that PS is congruent to PQ. You should notice that we're not proving triangles. So right before this step, we need to prove that one triangle is congruent to another triangle. So we're going to start with our statement and reason. Number 1, line segment QR is congruent to line segment RS, and that is a given. Our next given is PR, line segment PR, bisects angle QRS. And again, that's a given. You should notice right here, bisects is a mathematical term. And if something bisects something, we can state that angle 1 and angle 2, I'm just going to name them angle 1 and 2. Angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent to each other because a bisector divides an angle into two congruent angles. Okay, we used all our givens, so now we have to look at our picture and see if we could determine anything else. We should notice that line segment PR is shared in both triangles. So right here, PR is a part of this triangle and a part of that triangle. So we could state that PR is reflexive. So if you're looking at your picture, you notice so far that you have a side, an angle, and another side. Remember, we need 3 pieces of information to prove that triangles are congruent. Now we could go on and state that triangle PQR is congruent to triangle PSR. So PQR is congruent to PSR because of side, angle, side is congruent to side, angle, side. So since we proved that triangles are congruent, our next step is to go back and write whatever we're told to prove. So line segment PS is congruent to line segment PQ. Here we're proving segments, so our statement would be corresponding segments of congruent triangles are congruent.